Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Preparing to Open the Door to Marriage. This is our 12-week session class discussing various aspects of preparing oneself for marriage. Before Ramadan started, we began a few of these classes and even into the month of Ramadan. And as people dwindled away because of fasting, we decided to reset and start over with the beginning of the class last Friday. And as such, we took into account many of the feedback that were given during those first few sessions to make this experience better for everyone. Additionally, we had found that there were a few people who were trying to pretend to be other people or trying to listen in various ways without revealing who they were. So we also took precautions and measures to protect the participants in this seminar because we wanted to make it a safe space for exploration, for discussion, because these topics are sometimes sensitive topics, and oftentimes we don't have enough spaces to be able to discuss freely some of these issues, particularly with professionals like myself. So we wanted to give everybody that opportunity who wanted to take part in it. And so we are expanding that opportunity by putting these seminars on YouTube. These are 12 sessions that will give you an opening to the door of marriage. It's just a beginning, so that's why we say it's an opening. There are many, many more steps to consider, and we will have additional classes and training that help you build upon the skills that you will learn in this 12 weeks. So inshallah, I hope you will take the time to avail yourself of this free seminar. And on Friday nights, you'll see that this is called Friday Date Nights because on Friday nights is when we originally had the class. We broke the class into sessions for male only, female only, and mixed company to, again, accommodate the various perspectives of people. And there weren't really a lot of interested people in the male only section, so we now have taken it to 2 sessions, one at 5 o'clock, which is female only, that's 5 p.m. Pacific time, which is early enough for people on the East Coast to also participate, as well as 7:30 Pacific time. We have a mixed group, which is, again, still early enough for people on the East Coast to participate. And inshallah, it's amazing that we have actually people who have attended from around the world. And so I encourage you to do that. We do that on Zoom. And if you are interested, you will see at the end of this seminar our email, which is nafshealertherapy@protonmail.com. You can email us to get the link to register for the Friday night date nights sessions for discussion. Those have become discussion sessions. So the lectures will be on the YouTube channel, Muslims and Mental Health by Dr. Heather, and the Friday nights will be discussions. So it's not necessary that you have to participate in the Friday night sessions, but if you are a person who likes to talk through things, who wants to discuss things, who has feedback, who may have comments or concerns, that's where you want to take that time to do that. And it's very nice because you'll not only get to hear from me, but you'll hear from your peers and people who are older, younger, of diverse backgrounds, who might be able to just lay seeds of thought for you that are not necessarily covered by me, who have more real-time experience in terms of looking for someone to marry. Myself, in full disclosure, I come to you all having been married for 26 years, and so I've been out of the arena of looking for someone for some time. And so in that regard, your peers become a very good knowledge set for you. But how I hope to be helpful is to prepare you for that experience. So let's get started. And tonight or today, we're going to look at the idea of being married to ourselves. And some of you may be thinking, what is she talking about? What do you mean being married to ourselves? But this is the first step, honestly, and you becoming more aware and able to handle the concept and the real life experience of marriage itself. We first need to know ourselves to share ourselves with someone else. And this can be quite a process, especially if you've never been allowed to get to know yourself, you've never felt safe enough to get to know yourself, or perhaps you haven't been taught this idea even that you can have individual and autonomous thoughts of your own. And so this is something we're going to take a look at today. So first of all, I want to point out to those of you who have been attending the seminar previously, you should have received a syllabus in your email from my assistant about the coursework this time for the 12 sessions. If again you want to join, you can still join, and you just need to email us again at nufshealertherapy@protonmail.com, because it'll help you to see the syllabus and go over it week to week what we're going to cover that particular week. In addition, we have a website called 365 Days of Married Life. And on that website, you will see the syllabus posted later today, and it will be updated week to week with the weekly assignments that are going to go along with these seminars or lectures of the seminar. So again, that website is www.365 Days of Married Life. The number 3, 6, and 5, and then married.life, sorry. So another topic we're going to talk about today is how we start with ourselves, and what does it mean to be married to ourselves, why this is important, and then we'll follow up with the next steps for our next class, and we will then meet again next week. So let's get started. So we want to really start with ourselves. And as you can see here, I put a little picture here of a budding plant because we are all budding plants and we are all growing throughout our lifespan. And wherever you're starting from is okay, because that's where you need to be right now. And inshallah, you will grow over time and grow throughout your life. It is important that you always have an opportunity to continue to grow and grow and grow. Inshallah, you will start at one place and you will find yourself toward the end at a much different place. Okay, so just some initial thoughts that you might want to start when you're journaling in between classes as stems. Take the stem, if I were marrying myself, I would require, and then fill that in. I would like, and fill that in. It would be a bonus to have, and fill that in. I will not tolerate, and fill that in. I can compromise on, and I would leave if, meaning that kind of setting your boundaries for where you're able to both compromise and where you would be at your limit, where you would not have ability to tolerate anymore. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth as we get into this class tonight. But these are just some ideas as you're thinking about through the week. You might want to take one of these a day, or 1 to 2 a day, and just work on the ideas around them. What does it mean to be married to ourselves? As you can see here, we have a picture of a rose that's reflecting itself, because this work primarily is something that you do by yourself, right? You're going to be working on yourself, through yourself, for the betterment of yourself. And ultimately, we hope and pray that that's what your marriage is about, right? Becoming your best self, having a partner to help you become that best self. But again, the key word there, helping. as in supporting, aiding, helping you stand up, straight, and to become that best self, not to replace or fill in parts of you. Those parts and those pieces of yourself you want to be whole, or as whole as can be, before you enter into that relationship where you're, taking care of yourself and also giving to someone else. It's very difficult to give to someone else if you're still not quite sure about yourself. So let's look at that a little bit more deeply. So when I'm thinking about being married to myself, and this concept, I'll tell you, it really, again, I want to thank my students who started with me back in April, because they really caused me to reflect. We had a starting point, and I realized we actually needed to start further back. And we needed to start with this point, the idea of being married to oneself. And what I mean by that is that if we were to go through life, right, and we never got married, we would want to be okay with just being by ourselves, being married to ourselves, in the sense that we find our life fulfilling even if we're by ourselves. Because we know ultimately as Muslims, we're never by ourselves, right? We're never completely alone. We always have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with us wherever we go. And in addition to Allah, we have the angels, so many other beings. We're never really alone. But it's important that we are able to keep space alone, which you will encounter the question of being alone several times within your lifetime. We call this an existential review, right? Or consideration, the existential questions of why am I here? What's my purpose? And so forth. You'll encounter those questions several times throughout your lifetime. To the extent vis-a-vis that you are comfortable with being alone, you will be able to have more success in answering those questions. So this is a really important piece that you really want to work on now, from the time you're in your teens. We had some teenagers earlier on in this process with us, so you can start as early as your teens. But even if you've never done this process before and you're in your 50s or 60s, it's still worth doing now, because we can become healthy at any age. When I am healthily married to myself, I can look in the mirror and love and like what I see. It's a very hard thing to do, and most people report that they have a lot of difficulty with it, but I would challenge you all to take a moment and look in your mirror when you're at home, or if you're at home now, take a moment and look in your mirror and tell yourself that you love yourself, right? Like you just want to look in the mirror and say, I love you, right? I like you. Many people, if not most people, have a very difficult time doing this. And it's not because of vanity, because we have plenty of people who are vain, especially with the onset of social media. That's not really the issue. The issue is that there have been many, many messages in society that have trained us to not be okay with that. And it's not even an issue. Some of you might be questioning whether that's an issue of modesty, but that's not the issue either. We can still have haya or modesty and not, and also be able to acknowledge that we love and like ourselves. It's a really important piece that we do. Because imagine if I don't like or love myself, what am I going to be bringing to another person in marriage? If I don't like or love myself, we've seen the cartoons, right? Like Charlie Brown's cartoon with the dustbin, who always has the clouds of dirt around him. And if we don't like or love ourselves, that's sort of a metaphor for that. And if that's what we're bringing to someone else, why would they want to marry us? If we can't respect ourselves, if we can't, be respecting of ourselves, then how can we expect other people to respect us and also want to spend time with us in that space? So this is a really important piece. I want to feel, if I want to be healthily married to myself, I feel fine to be by myself. Again, highlighting this key point of being alone. And that I might feel lonely, which is very healthy to feel lonely at times, but I never feel completely alone because I always have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that goes to speaking to our spiritual development, which we will touch on a little bit later in tonight's lecture. And we'll touch on much deeper in another upcoming lecture. But these are really important pieces because to the extent that your family of origin, the family that you grew up in, focused on your spiritual development, this may or may not be more difficult or easier for you. And it's okay if it's either one. The important piece is to acknowledge whichever one it is and then choose to work on it. You want to be content with whether you're coupled or not. If being coupled defines your wellness, this is going to put you at risk when you're not coupled. If you can be fine and healthy, uncoupled, then being coupled is just a benefit. And I'm going to encourage you to really start framing in your mind the idea that marriage is an added benefit to your life. In Islam, and we will talk about this a few different times, in Islam, we are two individuals that come together. And again, we'll talk about this further in lecture 2, but it's like if you can imagine a castle. A traditional castle has an inner and an outer wall, and it has 2 walls because it has more strength by having 2 walls instead of one singular wall. And in Islam, that's what we do, right? We have 2 individuals who come together to join together, to benefit one another, and to encourage each other to become their best selves. What we don't do is have 2 people who join together to make one, right? This is a very popular notion in America because in the Judeo-Christian tradition, a lot of wedding ceremonies include what they call the unity ceremony, where 2 people are brought together to light, they have candles, and then they light one candle to show their unification. And so it's like they all become one. It's also in pop culture and movies like Jerry Maguire. There's a famous line where Renee Zellweger says to Tom Cruise, or might be the other way around actually, that Tom Cruise says to Renee Zellweger that you complete me, right? And the idea that he's not whole until he has her and she completes him. This is not what we're about. While we do have the saying that marriage is half your deen, it doesn't mean that you're going to complete another person. You might complete some aspect of your life process, but what you're not doing is completing another person. We are 2 whole people coming together to still remain 2 whole people who are in relationship with each other and who, for the benefit of becoming better Muslims, to create a better society, because family are one of the building bricks of society. So that's really a really important concept that you understand early on, because many people are confused and think that relationships are something that they're actually not. Again, here I've mentioned that see being coupled is an added value to my life, not necessary to my success. You can be quite successful without getting married. And we have many, many Muslims in our tradition. There's a whole book written about single Muslims who have contributed in the history of Islam, including people like Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah never got married, and there are a lot of other famous Muslims who themselves never married, but had a lot to contribute to our modern society of Muslims. You want to be able to enumerate and speak on the pieces that make up who you are. And we're going to go into that a little bit more in depth in a minute so that you can break it down to see exactly what I mean by that. You want to be able to then take all those pieces that you've identified of yourself and share them with somebody else, right? You want to be able to share what you need in relationships. You want to be able to be vulnerable enough to do that. And that requires safety and trust. You want to be able to be evaluative and critical of who you are, where you come from and where you plan to go. And again, to do those things, you need a certain level of safety and trust. I want you to keep in your mind that this idea, it's an alchemist term actually, but it's one that I think that is very helpful, especially for people who are not used to thinking well of themselves or who are not used to thinking of themselves, or who have not spent any time doing those things. And that is, your gold is not common gold. Each one of you has a unique set of gifts, talents, and much to bring to any relationship. The key is figuring out what it is that you want to bring into a relationship, what you need to have with it, what you want to have with it, and what you would like to have, right? So we're going to journey into this process of how to self-evaluate that you're ready for marriage. And our next segment here, we're going to look at about 25 or so aspects of how you can self-evaluate to see if you're ready for marriage. So are you ready? Let's begin. Okay, so number one, I am aware of my weaknesses and I'm not afraid to discuss them. I'm aware of my weaknesses and I'm confident I can share my innermost insecurities with someone else, be vulnerable in their presence without retreating. So I can step up and I can tell them, you know what? I don't like it when men flirt with other women in a group of people, and it makes me feel X, Y, and Z. And so therefore, I want a partner who doesn't do that, right? Or I am a guy and I am in smaller stature than other men, and when people make comments about that, it hurts my feelings. And so I just need you to know that, right? Those are a couple of examples that I've heard over the years. But you all have your own set of insecurities. So the key step there is to identify what your insecurities might be so that you can share them with someone else. I'm aware of my weaknesses and I can identify where I need to do more work, and I'm okay with embracing I am not a finished product. Inshallah, you're not a finished product, because if you are, we're already in trouble. Throughout our lifespan, as I mentioned before, we continually grow. And they've actually suggested in research, even recent research, that if you are able to continually grow and allow yourself to try new things throughout your life, even into your elder years, you will continue to have a strong cognitive ability. It's when we stop trying, when we stop learning, that the brain starts to decay and we lose those neuronal connections that allow us to have a healthy brain. And so, inshallah, all of you continue to learn and throughout your lifetime and not see yourself as a finished product already. I feel better knowing and confronting myself than hiding and disguising myself with others. So this is one of the key signs of knowing that you're ready, to enter into potential relationship with somebody else, because You can confront yourself. You don't need to hide behind avoidance, right? There are people who avoid conversations and avoid interacting with people because they're scared of themselves. It's not the other people necessarily they're scared of themselves. If somebody finds that they're scared of someone else, that's already a red flag that they don't belong in a relationship with that person. You don't want to be in relationship with somebody that you're scared of. I'm aware of my weaknesses and I'm clear about who deserves to know me and how close others are entitled to be to me. So one thing that we find that not everybody is given equal access to from their families of origin is understanding the boundaries of who is entitled to know you and know what, right? And it's really, really important that you get very clear about this because not everyone needs to know your most inner thoughts and desires. These things that we're outlining right now for you to know about yourself, they don't need to be shared with everyone. In fact, to the extent that they're not shared with everyone, makes them more of a prize. It makes them more, um, you know, uh, increased in value because not everyone has that information. And so in marriage, it works a similar way where the marriage is your marriage, yours and your spouse's, to the extent to which it is your marriage. To the extent that the world is let into your marriage, then it becomes their marriage or a group marriage, but not the two people who have entered into the marriage. And so this can be quite empowering to be very clear about those boundaries and who deserves to know what about you. And if you can keep those boundaries, you can have much more success in your life. In later lectures, we'll be talking about when those boundaries are breached by various members of society and also your family members, how this can create problems for you in marriage. And so you want to get really clear about that now. But that starts with also first knowing the boundaries about you. What are people allowed to know about you? And how much do you want that to be shared with others, and with what others? Before we move into the second piece, I found these ayat that are going to speak to this second principle. And so we'll just quickly read them. O you who have believed, avoid much negative assumption. Indeed, some assumption is sin. And do not spy or backbite each other. Would one of you like to eat the flesh of his brother when dead? You would detest it. And fear Allah indeed. Allah is accepting of repentance and merciful. O ye who have believed, if there comes to you a disobedient one with information, investigate, lest you harm a people out of ignorance and become, over what you have done, regretful. And do not pursue that of which you have no knowledge. Indeed, the hearing, the sight, and the heart, about all those, one will be questioned. And this is important because I wanted to bring you back to a remembrance of why we're here in the first place as Muslims, right? So we are basing this series on the fact that we are Muslim. And so you will find Muslim principles and thoughts interwoven throughout these lectures, although I may not always literally refer to Quran or Hadith. Sometimes I will, just to bring you back to that remembrance, but mostly I won't, because it's an underlying assumption that is the perspective and lens in which we're approaching this from. Now, the second principle is that my time with others is not filled with judging them. Sometimes we find comfort in recognizing and embracing not only our most obvious self, but also the shadow self that is out there too. So we have ourselves, how we would see ourselves, how we perceive ourselves, and then we have a shadow self. And the shadow self is typically made up of all those things that are not a part of our regular self, right? So let's say you are a believing Muslim, your shadow self would be that piece that would encourage you or play like sort of devil's advocate to get you to not practice, if that makes sense. So you have this constant movement toward how you perceive yourself, and then there's this other piece which is tends to be the opposite of that. It can look like many different things, but that's just one example. So it's important that we recognize that that exists, right? That the shadow piece exists because it's there. And it's one of the things that will influence your behavior with others. And we're going to talk about that a bit. We are able to accept all our pieces of ourself. So what I mean by that is that we're many different pieces. And you will notice that in different scenarios, you're going to be different things with different people, right? So when you're at home and you're able to be with your mahram, for example, you're not going to wear your hijab most likely, and you will have one kind of experience. When you're out in public, you have another kind of experience. So on the one hand, these pieces can be about experience. On the other hand, these pieces can be other things like your personality, your physicality, your spirituality, your biology. So, and even those can break down into many different pieces. It's really important to recognize that we have all these different pieces, and because the pieces sometimes can be contradictory, and people can think, well, I didn't realize that that person was like that. But we're all a bunch of contradictions, and so we will have contradictory pieces. What you want to be most mindful of when you're thinking about being married to yourself, right, is there congruency in the pieces that I have? And if not, where there is contradiction, are the contradictions so large that that might be problematic, or are they just contradictions that sometimes happen? There's a difference there, and it's important that you recognize what they are, right? So you can start by just taking any one of those topics, whether it be the spiritual self, the biological self, the physical, the social, the psychological self, and outlining what you think those different pieces are. And with each outline, you can be born another outline until you start to really recognize what the pieces of yourself are. You can fill them in along the way, but you can get started in just getting a sense of who am I, by doing these outlines and understanding these pieces of yourself. Sometimes we, thanks to Virginia Satir, who was a family therapist, one of the founding members of the whole theory of family therapy, she had great theories on communication, and she created what we call the parts party. And in the parts party, you would take various pieces of yourself and you would have them talk to each other to resolve a problem. And this is something you can do all by yourself. So we will get into a little bit more detail in another lecture about how exactly to do that parts party. But I just wanted to give you a little brief mention of it because it can be quite a useful tool. But it starts with first identifying the different pieces of yourself involved in who you are. Okay, so another aspect of this is I don't need to speak on others, utilize cancel cultures, degrade, demonize, destroy others to feel whole within myself. And this goes back to the judgmental piece, right? if I'm doing those things, if I'm practicing cancel culture, if I'm practicing degrading or demonizing people, going out of my way to try to destroy somebody's life, it really says something about me. And it goes back to that shadow self, because that's the shadow self. Well, the other person that you're doing that to represents your shadow self oftentimes, right? So they have something which apparently you feel envious about, because if you didn't, you wouldn't be going after them that way. And maybe you're not in touch with that piece, or maybe you don't want to acknowledge it. Again, going back to our previous concept, being honest with yourself, right? Sometimes we're just not in touch with those pieces yet, but often that is a reflection of that. If you are going to be so judgmental of someone else, and not try to understand where they're coming from or what they're about, then that really bespeaks something more about you and what's happening in that relationship between you and your shadow self. And so it's important that you take some time to really look at that, because that really should change. And it should be a red flag for people as they're considering a partner, that if you come into contact with somebody who's really into these pieces, cancel cultures, degrading people, demonizing them, trying to destroy people's life, or lives, then that probably is somebody that you are not going to have the most fulfilling relationship with, because they have a lot of work that they need to do first, quite honestly. I'm not froggy when others try to get me to jump, because I recognize you are who you are, and I'm happy and I'm fulfilled being me, right? So even though people antagonize you and they try to get you to jump, if, hopefully we want to get to that space when we're in a healthy position to just not fall for it. I'll be the first to admit, especially on social media, I have fallen for it before. People are coming at me, and then I snapped back. It's not a good position to be in. It's not a good thing to do. And so you really, really want to shore up those pieces of yourself, so that you can be the best you that you can be. I don't need to fixate on tongue lashing you, because I can't deal with me, and you irritate and rub up against that piece of me enough that I just want to judge you all day long. Again, that goes back to not feeling whole in oneself, because if people's problems are other people's problems, but if I feel confident in that I know who I am and what I need and what is going to fulfill me, I don't really care what other people are saying, because Allah is, the one who I need to care about. And Allah has assured us, right, that one, we're all going to taste death, and two, that none of us will leave this world without a full recompense of what we've done. And so knowing that, it doesn't matter what anybody else says. And if you can really get this lesson early on, you will have much success in your life. It's something that some people struggle with throughout their entire lives. And it's very human to experience it, and you're not less than if you do experience it. But it is really important that you learn to figure out how to get it under control. It doesn't matter what they say. In our tradition, in our community, in our cultures, oftentimes we hear this concept of they say, and they think, and they, but they doesn't matter when it comes to you, right? What matters when it comes to you is how you are living and choosing to live your life. And is it in the boundaries of what Allah has made halal and haram? If it is, then what they say or what they think doesn't mean as much as you might think. Another aspect of the they say is that there's a tendency in our community to push people to feeling that they need to be perfect. And this is one of the things that actually becomes a barrier in people's self-development. And so I put this in here as a reminder also, just to build on that last point. Abu Huraira reported, the messenger of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, said, by him in whose hand is my soul, if you did not sin, Allah would replace you with people who would sin, and they would seek forgiveness from Allah, and He would forgive them. This is from Sahih Muslim, and you can look up that reference. Now, why do I bring this up and put it here? I mean, I think it's kind of obvious for the last principle, but just to highlight and underscore it, we were not expected to be perfect on this earth and in this dunya. We were expected to be a people that would repent and sin and repent, right? So we sin and we repent. We do this from the beginning until the end of our lives. And to the extent that we lose sight of this fact, we are in trouble. And so as an individual, this is where you have an opportunity to do some spiritual checking in and cleansing, before you enter into that relationship with someone else. Am I okay with the fact that I'm not perfect? Can I, commit sins and repent? Can I avoid major sins, which is a real goal for a good life? If I can avoid major sins, then I'll probably have a pretty decent life. If I can avoid those major sins and then, repent for the minor ones that I may commit. If I make a major sin, can I repent and make tawbah and move away from that, right? It's possible that you didn't know what you were doing. It's possible that you did know, but you regret what you're doing. Make sure you repent and you move forward, right? And that you can be able to deal with who you are in that way, and also be able to share that with a potential companion. You want to be able to say, look, this is where I'm coming from, this is where I'm headed, and this is what I have to offer in that regard. And be okay with it, because that other puzzle piece out there that fits you to make the two whole people like a benefit to each other, it's out there somewhere. But it happens through feeling very sure of oneself and who you are whole as a person, connecting to another whole person. Next, I have no fear of my being with myself, right? So I can learn just as much from spending time with myself as I can spend time with others and embrace the person I meet. So I'm not afraid to be by myself. I enjoy being by myself. And, for me, the older I get, the more I enjoy time to pursue the things of interest to me. And this will appear more or less throughout your lifespan, but it's important that, you can learn just as much by being by yourself as you can in company with others. We're so used to asking other people in dialogue about them, and, we're usually pretty comfortable with that unless we're severely introverted, and then it's a challenge, right? But most of the time we're kind of used to, we've been trained to take interest in others. We've not been so much trained to take interest in ourselves, unless we have been more afflicted with some narcissism, right? So we need to learn how to learn from ourselves just as much as we would learn from others. I can accept that there are pieces of me that may not be like others, but I'm okay with that, right? I may have a different culture. I may come from a different race. I may have a different language. I may, be an immigrant. I may be indigenous. Who knows? We have all these different diverse pieces of ourselves, and they may not be like somebody else, but that's okay. To each his own, as we say. I can also accept that others' pieces may be different than mine, and I can accept that too while continuing to be myself. So I can be in company with you and I can appreciate you in the public square for being yourself, because I'm going to be myself and I'm going to expect that you respect who I am by myself. Just like I'm going to respect you for being yourself in the public square. In private, I may be a little bit more discerning in my choices of who I choose to spend time with, that have aspects that align more closely with what I need to become my best self. But in the public square, I can be with anybody, hopefully. I'm conscious of my decision making and I accept I may make mistakes. Again, we have to really look at that perfection piece. It is rampant within our community, and we need to do some self-correcting on the communal level in that regard, but definitely within ourselves. We don't have to be perfect all the time. And again, Allah reminds us of that in Quran and says, and go down from it, all of you, and when my guidance comes to you, and whomever follows my guidance, they will have no fear, nor will they grieve, because we don't need to be afraid of just being ourselves or by ourselves, inshallah. Number 4, I don't need validation from others outside of my mahram and myself, meaning those we are free to be around, whose company we are free to be in the company with, our fathers, for women, our fathers, our brothers, our uncles, and mothers and sisters, and for our men, the same, right? Basically the same. So I don't need to get validation outside of that group. And more, if I can self-validate, that's the best. But honestly, this is something that it's a developmental issue, right? It's a very human need, and that we have reflected to us that we are okay throughout our lifespan and okay within ourselves and within the world. Now, again, this goes back to spiritual development, but it also has to do with our family development as well. So Allah entrusts our souls to our parents, and that's a very awesome job for people to take care of. And one of those pieces within that parenting dynamic is to help that child, that soul that's in that vehicle of that child, to stand straight, to feel that love from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that validation from Allah, more than, seeking that validation from Allah more than from societal structures, let's say. But regardless, parenting helps to differentiate between the two, right? We are to train our children on how to understand validation within the dynamic and paradigm of the world, because we all need validation. And if we don't give that as parents to our children, they will seek it from other places. And that is just a normal human need. And so if we come across a person in our lifetime, which I assure you will, who seeks validation from outside this group of people I mentioned, it's most probably because they didn't receive it in their family of origin, or something compromised it in their family of origin, or something in society compromised it, some kind of trauma. And so if you see somebody seeking that validation, instead of thinking that they are validation junkies, the first question that I really want you to retrain yourself to think is, what happened to that person? And try to have empathy for them, because all human beings need validation, and there's a reason that they might be behaving that way. One of the examples I can think of that has happened within our own communal setting, particularly with living in a society where we as Muslims are minorities, is women who wear hijab, for example, many of the sisters who wear hijab have discussed how they don't receive a lot of validation from their male counterparts, uh, especially in their teen years, in their early 20s, when they're starting to really come into a sense of well-being and a sense of who they are as as women. And that's also a prime time when people start thinking about getting married. And when muhajiba women don't get that validation from at home, sometimes what can happen is they can start to have negative self-perceptions about their beauty, about if they're desired, and all of those sort of thoughts, those negative thoughts about the self. And it's not really helpful or productive, because it sets them up, because ultimately, whether you're a muhajiba or not, all the females in society are in competition for the men in society. So if our females don't feel assured, self-assured and beautiful and, able to embrace who they are as muhajiba, then they're also not going to be able to compete as well with those other people who are not covered, who can get the attention of men whose eyes or gaze is not exactly lowered. And so, this becomes a complex problem, communal problem again, but it starts at the individual and the family level. So it's really, really important that we find ways to validate from appropriate places. But if our parents, inshallah, do what they are charged with, then you learn how to self-validate. Or sometimes they call this self-soothe, right? Both can be equally important. But this is a basic need, and it's usually supported and reflected by those who are primary in our development. For example, our mothers, fathers, grandparents, siblings, and other extended family members. You will find that in your family of origin, and we're going to talk about this in a later lecture, they really affect your choices about who you marry, how you handle things, and so forth. When this piece is missing, as I mentioned, we can, or if it's been devalued, sometimes people are abused in such a way that they are devalued, or sometimes there's transgressions, like, traumas, sexual traumas, physical traumas, verbal traumas, many different types of trauma that can be transgressions. And so, and if those have occurred, then there's some repair work that needs to be done. And if this piece or pieces are affected in your life, I would definitely recommend that you consider therapy to help guide you to heal these pieces. Sometimes, especially given that the responsibility of this is within our families of origin, and when you look for help, typically, in a healthy way, people are first going to look at their family of origin. They're going to look at uncles and aunties. They're going to look at their imam or religious leaders. And if you have experienced one of these transgressions, those places may not be safe spaces for you, which is why therapy becomes important ultimately, as a consideration to help you through this piece. Number 5, I don't put all others before me, right? So how often do you put others' needs ahead of your own? This seems to proportionately affect women more than men, but regardless, we both our men and our women need to consider these questions, because it's important, as you are considering being married to yourself, that you learn how to put yourself ahead of others at least some of the time. So I want you to ask yourself these questions. How often do you put others' needs ahead of your own? Can I put myself first? Can I put myself first in the face of others' validation or the withholding of that validation, or attempt to invalidate who I am? So if they are attempting to invalidate you, can you still put yourself first? Or do you crumble at their invalidation? Can I distinguish between that which is compromising on an issue that is in the space of negotiation versus that which is germane to who I am as a being? So you figured out who you are, and can you hold your ground? Or do you choose to compromise that very self in the face of others? So this is really a question of, can I remain, now that I've found myself in a solidly constructed way, how solidly constructed am I? Can I stay solid when somebody else is trying to tear me apart, or do I fall apart? And oftentimes, again, this goes back to your family of origin. If you had a good relationship with your parents, usually, fathers with daughters and mothers with sons, they're quite affecting on the opposite gendered child and their ability to face this kind of validation or invalidation experience. I can find balance in the needs of myself and others and fulfill my communal and relational responsibilities without compromising myself. If you are there, that you feel like you have this balance between others' needs and your own needs, then you're in a great place to take that step forward into a marriage relationship. I know how to love myself. So what do we mean by this? Because it sounds, it can sound to people a little fluffy, but it's not. It's a very serious concept. And it's important that when we talk about love, that we're able to not only love others, but we can love ourselves. So what that looks like exactly in concrete terms might look different to everybody. It might even be quite unique to each person. So that's where we want to start, right? I can define what self-love looks like and feels like to me. So I want to be able to actually define this. And I would encourage you to even write it out, because when we verbalize something, it's very different than when we're writing it. When we're writing it, we commit it to our memories and our brains a little bit differently, and it stays a little bit longer. So write these things out. I can actively involve myself in activities that lead to, provide, and give self-love. So once I've identified what self-love looks like to me and feels like to me, do I actively involve myself in those activities that would give me that? If not, maybe I need to make a change there. Maybe I need to do more of that. Sometimes we refer to this as self-care, but it's also self-love. Additionally, part of that self-love is accepting my body in all its forms. Throughout your lifespan, inevitably, I'm sure you've noticed and witnessed with others in your life that your bodies change. They change all throughout your life. Sometimes it's because of choices you make, and sometimes it's just because of things that happen out of your control. And so you want to be okay with your body, because the more you are okay with your body, the more the people around you are going to feel that you are. I need to be able to accept my sexual needs, my desires, and realize it's okay to be a sexual being. Oftentimes, in our communities, our men have more experience with this only because of just the anatomical way that Allah created human beings. So men are in contact every day with their genitalia just because they have to go to the bathroom, and the two are a part of the same, whereas women typically are not, right? So, and what I mean by that is that because women's genitalia is inside, they don't necessarily see it. And in the United States, there are statistics that suggest that upwards of 80% of women never actually look at their genitalia in their entire life. So this is very sad. It's a very sad statistic because it indicates that women have been shamed about their sexuality, and that's across the board. It's not something that is just within the Muslim community. It is across the board, across all communities. And so we really want to encourage that to change, because sex is a very, very important part of marriage, and we need to be more comfortable with discussing it, with understanding our needs around it. It's one of the positive aspects that Allah has given us as human beings in marriage. So it's important that we really understand it and take time to understand it. So I looked at my private parts, I put under here as a form of self-love, that I know what they look like. I could describe them and accept them as something that Allah blessed me with, to both add to loving myself and to others, right? Some of you may even have a hard time just acknowledging that. I accept myself as a spiritual being with an ability to both move up or down in my moral well-being, dependent upon the work I do for my soul. Again, going back to that spiritual work, but under the rubric of self-love. When I feel unloved, I can identify tools and methods to feel loved again in a healthy way. And I have identified safe people in my life to help me when I feel like I am not able to provide enough love for myself, not as a dependent, right? We're not trying to become codependent on other people, but as an additive to. Sometimes, I don't know a lot about cars, but I know that in certain environments, when you have cold weather, they put additives into something in the engine to help it run better, right? And so it's like that, right? Where you identify people that you feel safe with, that you can trust, that you can be vulnerable with, who, when you're struggling to feel love for yourself, you can call them up, you can text them, you can sit and have tea with them or coffee, and help them, and they will help you return to being able to give yourself that self-love. Ultimately and hopefully, you are able to choose a spouse who will also be able to do the same for you. That's our hope, inshallah. Part of the getting there, though, is being able to communicate what it is you need that helps you fill your tank in terms of self-love. Number 7. Let's see. I don't actively seek to talk about myself. We are living in an unprecedented time where narcissism is at an all-time high, and there are many factors for why this might be the case. Everything from national leadership demonstrating this kind of behavior to things like social media and other outlets that encourage narcissism. So let's distinguish the difference between self-love and narcissism. Self-love is a healthy piece that we need to have as a part of our lives. Narcissism is something completely different. I really, really, really encourage you all to go back and read the Greek story of Narcissus, because you will find the true understanding of like what we mean by narcissism, right? Narcissus was this person who was like going through life and could not hear or listen to or pay attention to anybody else but himself. And he ends up drowning because he sees himself as a reflection of himself in the water and goes chasing after himself and drowns. But there are other people along the way in the story, such as echoists, who are people who are so not loving themselves that they fade into like an echo and basically disappear. And we've all come across people in our lifetimes who are like that, who basically don't have a sense of themselves, and they disappear and fade into the background. And that's a very unhealthy position to be in. One, because it doesn't allow you to be your best self, but two, because people like narcissists will hurt those people very badly, in fact. But let's look at this. Why would somebody be, or what are some of the characteristics of this? While I'm able to answer questions others have of me, I don't feel a need to take every topic and question asked back to myself as something that needs to be addressed about myself, nor a statement on myself. So for example, you're having a conversation in a group of people, and every topic that comes up, you'll hear the person say, "Oh, I did that," or "I had an experience like that," every time, right? And they need to have that center of attention on them all the time. And so this becomes very problematic, right? And so you want to kind of check yourself. Am I that person? Narcissists don't come out of nowhere. So, we can have a moment of empathy for narcissists because they actually come from, again, that family of origin not doing its job, not giving that love. And it oftentimes either comes from neglect or abuse. More often neglect, because they didn't get those messages and those experiences that made them feel loved, right? So they're seeking, it's very sad, really, because they're seeking to be loved, by others because they never got it when they were younger. And if you're one of those people, you can actually work on this. And again, it's something I would suggest doing in therapy, because sometimes you need a different environment than your family of origin, because that's, if they had it to give you in the first place, you would have gotten it probably the first time around. But you could do family therapy too. I am comfortable learning about others because I have done the work at home and in private that does not make me crave validation in the face of others or in the public square. Again, going back to what I just said, if I'm not there, I may need some work on this issue, right? Like I just said, this is a fundamental developmental issue. And you can even enter a marriage with this issue, but it may be one that you want to reveal to others as something that needs work, so that you can have the support within the relationship and not enter one that exacerbates this need. So if you are either one of those dynamics of the narcissist or the echoist, right? Because narcissists often attract echoists and vice versa. And that's, go read the Greek tragedy of it. It's very tragic. It doesn't work out well for echoist, and ultimately it doesn't work out for narcissist either, because he ends up dying. Echoist ends up fading into nothing. So it doesn't really work out for either one. But if you recognize that this is a deficit, then you can, work on repairing it. And sometimes that can happen through what we call a corrective emotional experience. And therapists are trained in how to do that. And so seeking therapy would be well advised in this case. Number 8, I am angry, right? So all our emotions, alhamdulillah, are such a blessing from Allah, and they all have positive and negative aspects to them. And anger is oftentimes labeled as one of those bad emotions, but it actually has some really great qualities to it. one of those is setting boundaries with people. When you start to feel angry, it's usually because you're hitting up against something that is what your innate self saying, this is not okay for me. I may not even be sure why it's not okay, but my anger is alerting me to the fact that it's not okay. And I need to work through what that anger is about and understand it before I proceed forward. It's important to resolve what your source of anger is, or at the very least acknowledge what it's about, so that you can communicate to others its need to be here, because it may be a fixture in your life. So for example, when we live in unjust societies, there might be a lot of reasons to be angry. And so sometimes people can become angry, or even a cousin of anger, like to the point of bitterness. Sometimes there is righteous anger. We see that happening right now in our country because of the historical injustices done around racism in our country. There is righteous anger, and righteous anger helps us set boundaries. It's not going to go away anytime soon unless those injustices are rectified in some way. So sometimes anger can become a fixture in people's lives. If another example would be people that have experienced war, or people that have experienced trauma of some sort. Sometimes anger is going to be hanging around for a little bit. So it's okay that it's there, but we need to understand why it's there, and then like how we can work with it, inshallah. Number 9, I don't lie to myself. So lies are often constructed because people cannot accept the cost of truth, or they can't live with the lie, like they can't live with the truth. They're embarrassed by the truth, or they're afraid of the consequences for telling the truth, either at a communal level or in a relationship. And so even in a relationship with yourself, some people lie to themselves, right? They can't accept who they are themselves. I've seen this happen many times within our community because of, again, going back to that very judgmental piece that happens in our community. So people might lie to themselves because they want to just exist. A couple of different examples that rush to my mind are, one I remember a while back, of some sisters talking about how they felt like brothers on campus, on college campuses, weren't really talking to them. And they would see them talking to other women on campus, but not them. And it left them with the feeling that they just didn't, like the brothers just would be happier if they didn't exist. Like they were a very inconvenient existence for them. Excuse me. In point of fact, another construction of that is that they could have, maybe they felt like they were being respectful by not talking to them, but the double standard or the double reality of that can make people lie to themselves, because that's not something that they really want to accept as being a part of their daily reality. And so rather than just calling it what it is, they just avoid it. And sometimes they do that by lying. Another one that I've noticed within many of the communities within our diverse group of minority communities is around socioeconomic status. So while it is very normal in other parts of the world to see people having people cleaning for them or cooking for them in a lot of homes, it's not as often seen in the United States. And so sometimes, depending on if a person is an immigrant and had that as their main normal reality culturally versus somebody who's indigenous, and that's not so much your reality unless you are, upper middle class and above. This can be a point of embarrassment for people, because part of American culture has been that we don't point out socioeconomic differences readily, right? Sometimes it happens, but it's considered a faux pas in American society. So unlike other societies where it's kind of normal to point out one's socioeconomic, difference, it's not in the United States. And so I've actually seen this play out where people feel a need to pronounce, that they have had these experiences, or sometimes they make up that they have, or whatever, because they don't want to be put in a category of less than because of socioeconomic status. And that's a very sad reality, but I've seen it repeat in our community a few times. And so people want to be comfortable with who they are, comfortable in their own skin. You don't decide most of the time whether you're born into a family that is in poverty or one that is born into wealth. And research, the really recent research suggests that within 2 generations in America, you could be either one. And so it's not a good look to be so haughty that you want to sort of boast about one or the other, right? Because Allah is ultimately in charge, and you could be a wealthy person and tomorrow not, or you could be poor and then Allah bestows upon you great wealth. So it's really something to think about. But the first person that you cannot lie to is yourself. And you really need to get honest with yourself so that you can be in relationship with other people. The second is the person, or are the people who you want to be in relationship with, including yourself, right? So you don't want to lie to yourself. You don't want to lie to Allah. You don't want to lie to your spouse, and you don't want to lie to your family. Now, again, this is very general because some lies are boundary dependent. Again, going back to my earlier concept, where there are some times where people do not have a right to access certain pieces of who you are. And there are people who are very intrusive or nosy or pushy. And so this is where, the idea of what people call white lies sometimes is, permissible behavior, because people are not allowed to access, transgressing certain boundaries. And you want to make sure you erect and keep strong those boundaries. So you need to really distinguish between the 2 or multiple settings that you may encounter within the public square. Who has a right to know what? And, sometimes when people avoid or evade something, that's not necessarily lying, because the people weren't entitled to that information to begin with. So I mentioned that so that you're discerning. But the key point here is just generally not to lie. Number 10, I'm secure being alone and married to myself first. Right? I'm okay spending this life alone if there are not good choices for me to make in a mate selection. I hear more and more readily that people feel like there are just not a good pool of people to choose from. Hey, if that's where you feel things are, then that's where you see it. It's not, incumbent upon you that you have to get married. You don't. So if you don't really think that there is somebody who's going to make you better in this life, then it's fine if you want to not get married. Bringing someone else into my life is to enrich it and not to bring me to a place where I can no longer look at myself. That's pretty self-explanatory. I should be able to see an improvement in most of the areas of my life in 20 years if I am with someone else. can I see an improvement in my life alone in 20 years? So if you're looking at being married to yourself and you're thinking about 20 years from now, how do I see my life progressing? Will it be better than it is now? You should be able to do the same thing when you're coupling with someone else. If you're in the same place that you were, if like you've been in a 20-year or more marriage and you're in the same place you were when you started, not such a great look. Someone is an added benefit to my life, meant to make my foundational structure more solid, not to complete me or fill in my cracks. We talked about that a little earlier. Number 11, I don't have to mask my emotions. Again, I'll just say one thing about this, as I mentioned it before. All of our emotions are a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The more we understand them and the more we invest in emotional intelligence, the better relationships we will have, period. And we should be able to talk to each other, especially our spouses that we're in relationship with, and on an emotional level. We should be able to express ourselves. To the extent that we can, the more fulfilling relationships we're going to have, just bar none. To the extent that we can't and we avoid emotional discussions, the relationship's not, it's going to be kind of bland. So something to really invest in. There's a whole course on understanding emotions in the body. Number 12, I am not too self-critical. So again, you want to look at your own behavior here. Some self-critical statements I put here to give you an example of what I mean by this. When people are self-critical of themselves, sometimes they say things like, I can't do anything right. I look horrible. What's wrong with me? I'm such an idiot. I suck. The world is better off without me. Why am I here? No one will want to be with me, right? These are some of the self-critical statements. And we think, oftentimes people think who are self-critical that this is helpful. But research suggests that not only is it not helpful, but it keeps putting them in a deeper and deeper negative position. And the thoughts we think and the behaviors that we do, each one of those is creating neuronal pathways in our brain. And the more we repeat them, the deeper they get, the harder they become to change. So it's really, really important what we tell ourselves. If you are one of these self-critical people, consider getting some help to change that piece of yourself. The other thing I can say about that too, when you're in relationship with somebody else, they're not going to enjoy that. They're not going to enjoy being criticized by you, because that becomes your habit of how you deal with the world. So not only are you going to be self-critical, you'll probably criticize others. And, you know, also people, this can lead to like low self-esteem, and people generally don't want to, you know, interact physically with people who don't have a good self-esteem. Number 13, I am able to take life in stride and embrace both the good and the bad. Pretty self-explanatory, but it's about finding balance and wanting to make sure that you have, you know, a balance of, you know, perspective on yourself. I'm not perfect. I can embrace that I have these good pieces. I have these pieces I need to work on that are quote unquote bad. And I can embrace all of that and move forward and continue to move in a positive direction. And when I'm in a relationship with someone else, I don't feel bad about myself just because I'm not perfect. Number 13, I can stand up for myself and also do not feel a need to take a defensive stance when somebody addresses an issue with me. So I like this little minion meme here. The world would be a better place if everybody took a chill pill. It would get even better if someone choked on it, right? So we see this happening when people start to get defensive. And some of you, it's really personality dependent, but some of you will react, you know, immediately. Others are more like crock pots where you need a lot to really get at you, but then you explode. And what I'm suggesting here is that we learn how we can stand up for ourselves. It's very important, but also we don't feel like we need to defend ourselves every time somebody has something to say to us, because again, a lot of times that's projection about something they need to work out through with themselves. But even when it's not, we don't have to be perfect. Sometimes we make mistakes, or sometimes people see something that doesn't stand out to us. Like last Friday night when we first did this lecture online, one of the students said to me, did you realize there's like Christmas connotations in one of the pictures? And I had no idea, actually. I didn't even pay attention to that. And so I corrected it because I wasn't trying to give that picture. But, like stuff happens like that, right? So I'm okay with it. And I really, really appreciated actually that they pointed it out to me. But sometimes this can be challenging. So if you're on social media a lot, this can be very challenging. Social media is a whole nother topic for another day. But people, all they have to go on is whatever pictures you post or the things you say in a very short message. And so it's a lot of projection. It's a lot of emotional, emotionally driven sort of experiences where people are trying to fill those cracks or get that emotional need that they didn't get in that family of origin met. So it's just not a great place to hang out. It has good pieces in terms of advertising events and things that are happening, communicating, more broadly concepts, but not really for socializing, which is kind of ironic. Flashpoints, like we've been seeing recently in our country, can often make people feel like they need to be defensive. But you don't have to take that bait. Again, and also hot buttons, right? Hot button issues. Sometimes people are just provocateurs. You don't have to respond to them. And the extent to which you have a bit of self-control in that way, the better off you will be. Number 14, I don't feel ashamed of myself for needing guidance or help and can ask for it. So self-explanatory. You're able to ask for help when you need it, and you don't feel ashamed about it. That's very important. Number 15, I trust my intuition. This is one of the blessings that Allah has given us, that we can listen to ourselves, our soul talking to us, that something is good for us, something is bad for us. Most of the time it's correct. Even if it's incorrect, if it's incorrect, you can go back and correct it. But if you're correct and you don't listen to it, sometimes it can be quite costly. Gavin de Becker wrote a book a couple decades ago called The Gift of Fear. And it's all about research and experiences around people who listened to their intuition when they were afraid of something, and how that in some cases saved their lives. The same is true here. When somebody shows you who they are, it's important to see it and listen. Trust your gut. Oftentimes it is correct. Number 16, I'm not constantly doing things I don't like or want to do. If you find yourself doing many things, or most of your time is spent doing things you really don't want or like to do, this is a huge sign that you're not in touch with your true self, that you're letting others define who you are, tell you how to be, and you're living out someone else's imagined life for you. You need to completely let go of that and start living your own self, right? And an exercise you can do to see where you fit on this paradigm is to draw a line on a piece of paper right down the middle of the page. Make a list of all the things you like to do and things you don't like to do on the other side, right? And see which side is bigger. Are you doing things that are mostly things that you like to do that are in line with how you see yourself? Or are you doing most of the things that you're doing in your life that have nothing to do with who you are, how you see yourself? And where do you stand? So just take that moment to have a real reflection of yourself and understanding. Number 17, I have passions, goals, and a life quest. It's important that you actually are very passionate about something, and that you have goals to pursue it, and that you have an understanding of what your goals in life are. You're going to want to share that with someone at some point. So it's important to get clear about it now. You may change this over time. It's very normal, but you want to get really clear so that you can articulate it and share with someone else. 18, I value freedom and independence and can also value others' need for it. So this is really important. It's so timely, actually, to what we're seeing, being reminded, what we're being reminded of in this country right now. In fact, this picture, I chose it because it reminded me of Maya Angelou and her writing. It's important that we value our own ability to have the freedoms that are within, the halal and haram, and have enough independence to be able to pursue, a life that is filled with those, again, within those boundaries, and also while at the same time respecting others' need for that too. If we are aware of what we need in life, and what makes us tick, and we have a solid foundation of that, then it is much easier for people to allow for others to have it as well. When people are so deeply insecure about their existence in this world and with this life, which is directly correlated to their spiritual existence, when that happens, then they're not able to allow others to also have freedom and independence, right? When we have seen things like war or other societal traumas occur, like scarcity, people clamp down and they try to control other people. And literally, in our society, we see people being put in cages, right? Whether it's in jail cells or in detention camps, at the border. So this is indicative of people not feeling secure in their own sense of freedom and independence. And so we see this happening to the extent that you can at least work on yourself in this regard. Then, every person, if they took responsibility and owned their own sense of values around freedom and independence, then society itself would change. Small changes make large changes in the big picture. 19, others are not telling me how to live my life or have defined it. In a lot of our cultures, this is a problem, and that sometimes we see generationally people not satisfied with how their life went, so then they try to live their lives vicariously through their children. And this goes back to setting boundaries. And we're going to discuss this in another lecture in more detail, because there's a lot more detail to discuss around this, but it can actually be a make or break factor in a marital relationship. It's one of the pieces that leads people to divorce when these boundaries are not kept well. 20, I'm not wedded to social media. Again, I cannot emphasize this enough. You really need to spend little time on social media as you can. because it's not healthy for most people. It actually is a detriment. 21, I can apologize and accept responsibility to myself and others. So if you can make mistakes and you can apologize for them, this is a really healthy sign. To the extent vis-a-vis that you cannot, that you have you ever been around one of those people that just cannot apologize for anything that they do? That is not healthy. People being willing to apologize, you don't lose anything by apologizing, right? You might be a little embarrassed, but the more you get used to apologizing, the more that embarrassment goes away, in the sense that you just realize that it's the right thing to do. 22, I can equally celebrate my successes while seeing room for improvement. Again, we don't need to live in a world of perfection. We can celebrate, but then we can also see that I'm not finished. I'm not a finished product. I'm going to be continuing to work on myself throughout the lifespan. 23, I have a connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as my primary relationship in life. This is the time of the year that we're seeing a lot of graduations, and a popular book, that I like to give to graduates during this time is a Dr. Seuss book called Oh, the Places You'll Go. And it talks about all the different places that you'll go throughout life, and how a lot of times in those different spaces and places you'll feel alone, and alone is something that you'll feel a lot. And so the way to really avoid loneliness is to increase that relationship that you have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And sometimes people are afraid of investing in that relationship because it hasn't been modeled for them and their family of origin, or they just really not sure how to access it. And this is where I would refer you back to the religious leaders within the community for help. Also, there are many books that you can read, but our spiritual leaders can give you help in learning how to access that connection and that relationship if you feel alienated from it, or not sure how to pursue it, because it's really crucial to have a solid relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. 24. I am clear about my dream for marriage, family, and my place in the world. Most people are unaware that men mostly report having dreams for their families, even though they may not share them. When they're going into a relationship, they usually have a whole dream mapped out of what they want that to look like. So, and women, often report having something like that for the process of marriage, but not necessarily the whole life plan, although some do. But I want to encourage you to actually develop one. What are your dreams for marriage and family? Can you articulate the big picture? So like from that 50,000 foot view, and how detailed is your dream? And the reason why I really want to encourage this is because I want you to be able to articulate it to that potential partner, so that you can see, do we basically have the same ideas for our life journey? And lastly, 25, doing the work to put you in your dream. So once you've identified what that dream looks like, are you taking the steps to make that happen? Of course, nothing happens without Allah's permission, but are you taking the steps that you are able to affect to make that happen? Why is this important? Well, I think it's quite obvious based on our discussion why this is important, but it's so important to the quality of the type of relationship that you're going to embark on when you get married. To the extent that you can work through these issues as an individual, the more you'll be able to engage wholly in a relationship with another whole person. And you'll also be able to attract that which you are putting out, right? So if you're putting out, I'm a work in progress, but I'm generally a whole person, then I'm going to be able to attract somebody who also is in that same space. Because what we know from research is that people generally are attracted to people who are at the same level of emotional space as the other. So if you are not in a good place emotionally and psychologically, you'll probably attract somebody who mirrors the space that you're in. So you want to really be your best self or version of yourself that you can be at this time in your life, because that's naturally who you're going to probably attract on the other end. Not always, but most of the time. So we want to put our best self forward when we're looking for that potential mate. So we've come to the end finally, after we're approaching 2 hours. Our next class and our next steps. Next class, we're actually going to delve in deep into who am I. We're going to start out with 2 aspects of what we call the 4 horsemen, the 4 big issues that tend to lead to divorce. So we're going to really look critically at those 4 over the next 2 classes, and then take next steps toward that. I have put on your syllabus some additional questions to ask yourself this week, but as you've seen throughout this lecture, I've given you lots of different exercises to do. I'd like you to try at least some of them, if not all of them. I mean, depending on how much time you have to devote, at least some of them, if not all of them. We will entertain on Friday questions and a discussion about this lecture. Again, we did one on Friday, but not everybody was able to attend, so I'm going to extend it to this coming Friday, and then we'll move into the second class, which will be posted next weekend for you to watch, and then we'll discuss that the following Friday, inshallah. Thank you very much, and I would like to encourage you all, if you haven't done so already, of course, this class is free, but we always need resources at the Center for Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology to be able to expand and be able to do these kind of things. So we right now currently have, for about another week or so, 3 Launch Good campaigns to support different projects that we have happening at the center currently, including providing services for those people who can't afford them. So I would encourage you to, donate as you can, or if you know somebody else who has greater capacity to donate, please help them to donate to us so that we can reach our goals, inshallah, for the next year. And if you have any comments, questions, or concerns, you can reach me at nafshealertherapy@protonmail.com. And again, I look forward to seeing you all next weekend and another lecture, but also seeing you all on Friday night for a robust discussion, inshallah. Have a great week, and may Allah bless all of you, and be well. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.